Let's jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a truly shocking geopolitical reality. Right now, the historic alliance between the US and UK, the famous special relationship, is actually fracturing. And the crazy part? It's not over a border in Europe or some massive trade deal. It's over a windswept, mostly empty archipelago sitting literally 13,000 kilometers away from Britain. To the British, they're the Falkland Islands. To Argentina, they're the Islas Malvinas. Today, we are going to explore exactly how shifting superpower dynamics are threatening to completely upend a 200-year-old sovereignty dispute.
Now, what's really interesting here is the staggering 34% figure from Gallup and YouGov. If you go back to the start of the 21st century, public favorability between the US and the UK sat comfortably above 80%. But in just the last 5 years, the favorable view of America and Britain has practically crashed to just 34% today. We are looking at a populace rapidly drifting apart, and frankly, that sets the perfect stage for a massive, unprecedented shift in foreign policy.
And that drift brings us to the core catalyst for this explainer. In late April of 2026, Reuters published a leaked internal Pentagon memo. See, historically, the United States has maintained strict neutrality regarding who actually owns these islands, balancing its alliances with both the UK and Argentina. But this leaked memo reveals that the Trump administration is actively exploring reversing that long-time neutrality. Why? Well, as retaliation, it's being viewed as a calculated way to punish a NATO ally, the UK, specifically for Prime Minister Keir Starmer's refusal to offer British assistance in the US-Israeli war on Iran.
So, to really grasp the magnitude of this leaked memo, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the catalyst. Next, 2 centuries of dispute. Then, the cost of defense, oil, and new precedents. And we'll wrap up with the diplomatic fallout.
All right, Section 1, the catalyst, a leaked memo and a fracturing alliance.
To really understand this potential policy reversal, you've got to look at the deeply personal dynamics driving U.S. foreign policy right now. On one hand, you have a severe, growing rift between U.S. President Donald Trump and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. On the other, you have Trump's exceptionally close personal and ideological alliance with Argentina's conservative president, Javier Milei. The disagreements between the US and the UK are just compounding rapidly. I mean, Starmer explicitly stated the war in Iran does not concern Britain. He refused to let the US use British air bases to strike Iran, and he refused to send forces to secure the Strait of Hormuz. Add to that the UK's vocal opposition to Trump's ambitions to annex Greenland, plus disputes over severed American aid to Ukraine. The personal fury here is palpable. Trump actually publicly denounced Starmer as no Winston Churchill and called the government cowards. Meanwhile, President Milei in Argentina has perfectly aligned his foreign policy with Trump's. It's almost reversing the dynamic of the 1980s when Reagan and Thatcher's close friendship really defined the era.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. 2 centuries of dispute and the core arguments of sovereignty. To get why this specific archipelago is the absolute most geopolitically controversial landmass in South America, we need to neutrally look at the ingrained national identities and historical claims of both nations. For Argentina, this claim is woven into the very fabric of their nation. The islands are only 500 kilometers from their shores. They argue they inherited sovereignty from Spain upon their independence in 1816, and this claim is so vital, it is literally embedded in the Argentine constitution. For the UK, the argument centers on continuous, peaceful administration of the islands since 1833. Even though they're a staggering 13,000 kilometers away, the UK insists the roughly 3,600 island residents have the absolute right to self-determination. And they back that up by pointing to a 2013 referendum where an overwhelming 99.8% of voters chose to remain British.
Tracing this friction through history reveals some incredibly deep roots. Early discovery is disputed, sure, but the first documented landing was by the English in 1690. After decades of varying French, Spanish, and early Argentine settlements, the British forcefully reasserted control in 1833. But the absolute defining moment of modern history here was 1982. Argentina's military junta launched a surprise invasion, which sparked a devastating 74-day war. 649 Argentine and 255 British service members died. And because of that spilled British blood, the UK is effectively politically unable to ever voluntarily surrender the territory today.
Which brings us to Section 3, the cost of defense and asymmetrical military commitments.
Ever since that bloody conflict in 1982, the UK has absolutely refused to be caught off guard again. But maintaining the geopolitical status quo on these remote islands requires an asymmetrical and frankly astonishing financial and military weight. Just look at this defense spending disparity. If the Falkland Islands were an independent country, their defense spending as a percentage of GDP would be roughly 55%. That eclipses even war-torn Ukraine, which hovers around 40% while fighting an active invasion. Meanwhile, following decades of economic crises, Argentina's military budget had actually crashed to a mere 0.5% of its GDP by the early 2020s.
To put that massive cost into everyday terms, the UK spends roughly £42,000 per island resident every single year, just on defense. They've essentially built a vast military fortress at RAF Mount Pleasant. We're talking highly advanced 4.5-generation Eurofighter Typhoons on perpetual quick reaction alert, sophisticated anti-air missile systems, and over 1,500 military personnel. So while President Milei is working hard to modernize Argentina's military, like with their recent purchase of used F-16s, military analysts agree that another Argentine surprise invasion today is practically impossible. The UK would see it coming a mile away, and they have overwhelming air superiority already in place.
So the crucial point is, Section 4, Oil and New Precedents, and why the dispute is heating up right now.
If a military invasion isn't viable, why is this dispute heating up to a boiling point today? Well, it comes down to incredible modern accelerants that make controlling these islands far more valuable and legally contested than ever before. Back in 2010, the Sea Lion oil field was discovered just north of the islands. It's estimated to hold up to 1.2 billion barrels of oil. With current inflated global energy markets, thanks to the Iran war, that oil is valued at a staggering $125 billion, and production is scheduled to begin in 2027. This astronomically increases the economic incentive for both nations to dig their heels in. It could theoretically make every island resident a millionaire in royalties. At the same time, Argentina views the entire operation as the illegal extraction of their natural resources.
And right alongside that massive economic shift is a major shifting legal argument. In 2024, the UK bowed to international pressure and agreed to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Argentina's President Milei explicitly points to this as a legal precedent. He argues it proves the UK can be forced to hand over disputed territories to comply with international law. The UK, however, firmly rejects this comparison. They unyieldingly argue the Falklands are entirely unique, pointing out there was no pre-existing indigenous population that was displaced, and crucially, unlike Chagos, British lives were sacrificed in 1982 to defend them.
That brings us to our final section, Section 5, the diplomatic fallout and the threat of global isolation.
Let's return to that leaked 2026 Pentagon memo for a second. If the United States acts on its frustration with the UK and formally abandons its neutrality to side with Argentina, well, the military reality won't change overnight, but the diplomatic reality will trigger a sweeping geopolitical domino effect. And this brilliantly illustrates how the diplomatic board is set right now. The UK is already heavily isolated on this issue. Every single nation in Latin America, permanent UN Security Council members like China and Russia, India, and as of 2025, even Israel, recognize Argentina's claim. The UK relies almost entirely on close Anglosphere allies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. If the US flips its stance, other US allied nations are highly likely to follow suit. That would create an almost unbearable level of diplomatic pressure at the UN, potentially forcing the UK into the bilateral negotiations they have fiercely resisted for over a century.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. We are witnessing a massive clash between vast offshore wealth, deeply ingrained national pride, and a rapidly deteriorating alliance between the world's leading Western powers. Will the Falklands-Malvinas dispute be the final catalyst that destroys the century-old special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.